Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. I have been asked to do a video about anti-colonial movements and agreements and disagreements between liberal and conservative strands within those. So I am such a generous-spirited chap. I do these things at fairly short notice at the request of my innumerable adoring subscribers. Right, so first of all, what's colonialism? Well, it's been around as long as civilization's been around, but we tend to focus on European colonialism over the last 400 years, roughly. But the word colony, it's an ancient Greek word. It's from when there was land hunger in Greece, in the ancient Mediterranean world, and they would sail and settle somewhere else on the coast around the Mediterranean, and that's that. So it's about expansion, sometimes by agreement with the indigenous people, sometimes not. And it's not about formally integrating this new territory within the metropolitan. It doesn't become part of the domestic state. It has a different status. So it's a vast subject, so I'm just going to have to telescope it into a few minutes. So I thought I'd focus chiefly on the British Empire from the 19th century into the 20th century. So what did anti-colonialists want? Well, they wanted an end to colonial status. So they wished to regain independence. Sometimes total independence, sometimes a wide degree of autonomy. I'm focusing primarily on these movements which were led by autochthonous peoples and not settlers. For example, go back to the 18th century. In America, in the 13 colonies, people rebelled. They were almost all whites involved in the American Revolution, mostly of British descent. So these were the settlers rebelling against the mother country, right? As opposed to, let's say, take case of India, where the Britishers, as in white Britishers, were a tiny, tiny minority of the population of the country, not even 1 in 1,000 people. So the anti-colonialist movement was not those of settler descent, not the white immigrants rebelling against London. It was the indigenous people, the Indians whose ancestors lived there for millennia. They were the ones seeking to end India's colonial status. So there were disagreements between liberal and conservative strands within anti-colonialism. And, well, what's the core dividing line? Difficult to say. Well, I suppose if I have to come up with one question is, do we want to imitate the colonizers or not? Do we want to imitate them in some ways? Now, even the most conservative-minded anti-colonialists usually tacitly recognized that there were some things they'd gained from colonialism. They weren't going to reject all technology or scientific advances. But they usually thought that the political economic system that had been introduced by the colonizers was useless, had no application, or ought to be done away with. So anti-colonialism as an organized political force really got going in India in the late 19th century. So remember, the Mughal Empire declined and wasn't actually formally abolished until 1857. The British East India Company had acquired dominion over most of what's now India, some what's now Bangladesh, and even Pakistan. And there were hundreds of Indian princes, indigenous rulers, and they accepted the paramountcy of the British crown. So these Indian rulers within their princely states could carry on ruling more or less as before, with a British resident there, as in a British official who was the voice of the British colonial authorities. And so long as the Indian ruler didn't do anything to really irk the Brits, that he could run the show as before. That was that. So these were princely states, and obviously some of India was directly under British administration, with district commissioners, people especially trained to be out there. And remember, until 1858, it was the Honourable East India Company who was governing much of India, and not the British government directly. The British government was indirectly involved because of regulating acts every 20 years from 1783 onwards. The British government took more and more control, but it wasn't completely in control until after 1858. So then there was the Indian Mutiny, which broke out on the 10th of May, 1857. They were Indians often like to call it the first war of national independence these days. And it's partly over cartridges. Are they greased with animal fat, cow fat, or pork fat, either of which are completely anathema to either Hindus or Muslims. So there weren't political parties in India at the time, so it wasn't an explicitly political movement as in wanting to elect people to a legislature. So to some extent it was actuated by the religious reaction. To some degree it was just disliking the haughty attitude of some British colonial officials and officers in the Indian Army. The Indian Army obviously is pro-British at this stage. And more general discontent, the fact that some indigenous Indian rulers had been disposed by the British authorities on the grounds that they had grossly misruled their subjects, things like that. So it seems to have been more of a reactionary movement and motivated by religious concerns. Anything else? So that would be a more conservative or even ultra-conservative one. But then from then on, things become more explicitly political. Take 1985, the foundation of the Indian National Congress, this political party, again founded with the imprimatur of the British Raj to provide a critical analysis of the way that the British colonial authorities were governing the country. And so the Congress, it took this name from the American Parliament, they call it Congress. Or indeed, if we accentuate it differently, there's a verb to congress, meaning to gather, to come together. And so to begin with, it was cooperative with the British authorities, but from 1905 it becomes more oppositional, especially after the British authorities considered dividing Bengal into Hindu and Muslim halves. Congress is a liberal anti-colonial movement, and to begin with, of course, is not actually anti-colonial. It wants reform within the system, but it doesn't ask the fundamental question, should we be a colony at all? Seems to simply take it as axiomatic that India is better off under the British aegis. Remember, this is the zenith of European imperialism: British, French, German, Dutch, Portuguese imperialism. Spanish imperialism obviously majorly declined after the 1820s, when most of Latin America became independent. So the Congress was led by usually bourgeois intellectuals who were part of that tiny minority of Indians who spoke English, and some of them being educated in the United Kingdom. Sri Aurobindo, who then became more of a spiritual rather than a political leader, going to St. Paul's, and I think did he go to Cambridge as well? But otherwise, they were often barristers. So even if they hadn't been educated in the UK, they still spoke fluent English. Take Motilal Nehru, father of Jawaharlal Nehru, and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and so many others, Gandhi, Jinnah, all barristers. Remember, Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, was originally in the Congress Party. So they were very much liberal anti-colonialists who were filled with admiration for British institutions and simply wished to replicate them in India, saying, well, why can't we have this? It seemed very much the Whig view of history, belief in progress. As more of the population becomes literate, as technology advances, so we can advance politically and have more representative institutions. And at first, only the lettered classes should be allowed the franchise. Eventually, we should permit more people to vote, have greater freedom of expression, and so on. Elected bodies and greater degree of self-governance. So that's steady progress. Whereas a more conservative-minded anti-colonialist will say, no, we've got to go back to the way it was before and have despotism. Now, mustn't be too simplistic about it, because India's had elements of democracy for millennia. Sometimes been fairly democratic, sometimes been completely autocratic. It's gone back and forth, just like in other countries. So have panchayats at village level. So these ideas are not originally Occidental. If you go back to Ashok, an ancient Indian emperor, he had all sorts of nostra of human rights and made tremendous advances in emancipating the downtrodden. But there were Indian nationalists like, say, Gokhale, who said that the British rule provided him with an appreciation of the liberal values, or Ram Mohan Singh likewise. So the First World War was really a sea change, seeing that there wasn't progress, there was such massive slaughter. As Thomas Hardy wrote a poem entitled Christmas 1915. Now listen to this for an epigram. Peace on earth, we sing it, and pay 1 million priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas. So British rule didn't seem to be at the betterment of people, and the British government were under serious pressure to make major concessions to Congress after the First World War in return for vocal support, persuading men to join for the Indian Army and so on, and all the donations that Indians made to the British war effort, financial donations. Very little happened, and Indians find they're discriminated against, and South Africans so forth. So these liberal anti-colonialists become bitterly disappointed at the heavy-handed response of the British authorities after the First World War. Now, Jinnah is a mercurial figure, having been in Congress, later as founding the Muslim League as a section within Congress, and then splitting off to form a completely separate party. And relations between the Congress Party and the Muslim League were increasingly hostile through the 1920s, and then flooding with this Pakistan demand, which of course Jinnah didn't come up with. Chowdhury Rahmat Ali, who was living in Cambridge, came up with this one. Allama Muhammad Iqbal, this renowned poet, he's the one who invented the word Pakistan. But so, although they want to build a homeland for Muslims and not a Shariat state, let that be triply underlined, but the distinction between the two was lost on many people, and Pakistan's ended up being an Islamic republic. So they did want to copy Western institutions to some extent, but because it was based on a religion that was a little bit different, that pulled it in a more of a conservative direction. And Gandhi, Nehru, and the other Congress leaders, they were attracted to socialism. They weren't totally anti-capitalist. Remember, communism very much intellectually en vogue at the time, but they didn't go that far. They had good relations with some people in the British Labour Party and so on. And there were Indian nationalists in the UK since the late 19th century. At Oxford and Cambridge, there was a Majlis, each as in an Indian society, to debate Indian issues of subcontinental concern. And they found a sympathetic hearing amongst radicals. And take, say, Fenner Brockway, a Labour MP, who from the 1820s was deeply sympathetic to them. Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, said, India's got to make progress towards independence. Even the founder of the Labour Party, James Keir Hardie, he had a soft spot for Indian nationalism, though he didn't propose immediately dissolving the British Raj. So, turning our minds to Africa more, well, let's say Jomo Kenyatta, not quite sure when he was born, but he became a notable figure by the 1930s. So he was Kikuyu, and he first of all founded the Kikuyu Central Association. Initially, his identity was completely tribal, Kenya being a British invention. He cared about Kikuyu people. Why should he care about these other tribes? Why don't we go to other nations? So Kenya was invented by Britishers. If they were to go, then Kenya could go too, could split up again. But anyway, he spent some time in Germany as well as the United Kingdom. Indeed, he married a white woman, and he also visited the Soviet Union. But he was ahead of his time in rejecting communism, saying, do not look to this for liberty or economic advancement, because the Soviet Union was very much promoting the cause of anti-colonialism. Other anti-colonial activists gravitated towards Moscow, joined Cominterners and Communist International. Take Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese nationalist leader who'd helped found the French Communist Party, spending some time in Moscow. And the Soviets had held a Congress of Peoples of the East in 1920, held it in Baku, proposing Red Revolution in all these European colonies. It was richly ironic that they should do so in Azerbaijan, which until earlier that year had been an independent country, and communist Russia then just invaded it and crushed it and forced it to join the Soviet Union. There we go, an Asian people, if you will, being conquered by a European people. But they were not one for applying their principles universally. So Kenyatta, he returned to Kenya, and he published a book, Facing Mount Kenya, but it's really an anthropological study of his own tribe. So did he want to replicate European institutions? Somewhat. He's more of a conservative figure. But right after the Second World War, many Kenyan ex-soldiers from the King's African Rifles were disappointed with the way they'd been treated. They'd participated in the liberation of Abyssinia, we now call it Ethiopia, from the Italians. And some of them began asking, what on earth are we doing booting out the Italians from this African country when we have other Europeans ruling our country? So shouldn't we care about that? And they didn't like discriminatory laws or the way the white minority hogged the wealth. So Dedan Kimathi was one of these ex-soldiers who began a rebellion, Mau Mau, but it was very much a reactionary thing. It was more of a religious cult, It was strictly for one tribe only against some of the other tribes. So although they had their parliament, the Mau Mau movement, they were backward looking. They weren't wanting to replicate Western institutions, whereas the Indian nationalists, for the most part, felt betrayed that the British, they preach democracy, but they give us authoritarianism. They talk about freedom of expression, that being sacred, and yet so often they've clamped down on it. They've restricted things, they've suspended habeas corpus, they banned certain publications, they prohibited the display of the Congress flag, which became the Indian national flag, and on and on. So they betray their own heritage. Really, it's just guff. This is hot air. This has got to be for us. They looked at settler colonies, like, say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and these colonies, which were principally peopled by whites. From 1867 onwards, they were progressively granted self-rule, Canada being the first one. Their own institutions, and they're internally self-governing. They're part of the British Empire. They rely on the United Kingdom for defence and foreign affairs, but otherwise they make their own laws. So why can't we have the same? It's because we're not white. It's that basic. It's outright racism. So they were deeply dissatisfied with that. And South Africa got the same, got Dominion status. Really, 1902, the Second South African War ends, the Peace of Vereeniging, and I can't think when the Union of South Africa formed as such, 1910. But the whites, who were only 22% of the population, they had political rights. Very few non-whites had the franchise. So that was another example of injustice. So you see in Kenya, more of a liberal anti-colonialist, Jomo Kenyatta, more of a conservative one, Dedan Kimathi, wanting to keep this tribal structure going, and partly inspired by spiritualism, had little truck with these Western Nostra, and whereas the Indian nationalist leaders, mostly they were fascinated by liberal ideology. Some Indians were elected to the British Parliament, Dadabhau Naoroji, Bau Nagri, both parties, incidentally. The first one liberal, I believe the second one conservative. So they wanted to introduce such institutions into India. They're filled with admiration for them. And Nehru, for example, said he had a most lively interest in British politics. He followed the Liberal Party. When he arrived at Harrow, Campbell Bannerman had just become Prime Minister. He visited Ireland, the whole of Ireland, part of the United Kingdom at the time, and he drew inspiration from the Irish Home Rule Party. There was even an Indian Home Rule Association. Dr. Annie Besant, an Irish woman, she was out in India. She was a luminary of the Congress Party, but later things changed a little, and she founded the Liberal Party in India, which became very tiny, which felt that Congress was going too far. But mostly she's known for the Theosophical movement, which is a curious religious philosophical organization. And that she diverted her energies into that. Okay, so moving on to West Africa, so often overlooked. Well, Kwame Nkrumah is perhaps the standard bearer of anti-colonialism in that part of the continent. So Kwame Nkrumah, he'd spent a long time in the United States. He was a highly educated chap. He had a PhD. This being a time when most people in Ghana couldn't read at all. So he was very worldly, been in the United Kingdom as well. And there was a anti-colonial conference in Manchester, UK, in 1946, and many of these people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Dr. Hastings Banda, they all met there. They said we've got to have freedom of expression in the colonies. And isn't it hypocritical for the British to say they're fighting a war for freedom whilst they're depriving us of that in Africa? And they'd seen the example of India gaining self-government and thought that we ought to do likewise. So he returned to Ghana. It was then called the Gold Coast, of course. He had the Gold Coast People's Congress as political party. Congress possibly taking the word from the Indians. And he began agitation. The Soviet Union was broadcasting propaganda, trying to stir it up. They realized they could enfeeble the British Empire. He's briefly imprisoned. But the UK caved in quite quickly because there was such a charismatic figure who really energized Ghana to strive for independence. In 1957, it was agreed that Ghana would become completely independent, had been internally self-governing until that time. So the Queen went out there and she famously danced with Kwame Nkrumah at the independence celebrations. Now, that would have had him lynched in some parts of the United States at the time, him dancing with a white woman. Of course, I don't object to that at all, that it's absolutely right that anyone should dance with anyone else of any colour. It's vile to be discriminatory in this way. But I wish to point out that the British weren't that bad all the time when the Queen would dance with him. So one of the Western intellectual fads that Nkrumah picked up was Marxism, which the aforementioned political activists were not attracted to. They had examined, didn't reject it outright, but Nehru said he disliked the communist habit of condemning those who don't completely agree with them. Nehru looked at Japanese imperialism in China, thought it was dreadful, thought that the West should stand up there. He was sympathetic to the cause of the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39. They're part of a more general radical movement. So Nkrumah, he gradually turned his country into a communist one-party state, and he was overthrown in 1968, and he fled to China. He was also Pan-Africanist, as in he cared about the whole continent, wanted to eventually unite. He was married to an Egyptian. And remember, Egypt was an informal colony for a long time until 1955. Then came the Suez Crisis. So what else about anti-colonialism? Yeah, look at Malaysia, or Malaya, as we used to call it back then. Remember, Peninsular Malaya and Borneo were separate at the time. So Peninsular Malaysia was divided into 13 states, 9 of which had sultans, as in hereditary rulers, the kings. So the Malays are the indigenous people. They're Muslims, speaking the Malay language. There was a large Chinese community, perhaps 20% of the population, arrived in the last couple of centuries, particularly urbanized. Likewise, about 10% of the population was Indian. So what was going to happen? The Japanese had just been kicked out. Some of the most stalwart anti-Japanese fighters were communists, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, mostly ethnically Chinese, whereas the Malays tended to get along with the Japanese. It was only a 3-year Japanese occupation. But pretty soon, the British colonial authorities collided with the communists in Malaya, and there was a conflict. Now, the communists there were overwhelmingly Chinese, which is not to say that all the Chinese were communist. Remember, mainland China had just become a communist state in 1949. But the Malays usually saw communism as something alien, something Chinese, something anti-Muslim. And the Malays are Chinese to a man. Almost no Chinese are Muslims, and only a minority of the Indians there were Muslim. Most of them were Tamils, from Tamil Nadu in India, Hindus. So the British colonial authorities and the Malays fought against the communists and eventually defeated them. And some British people are quite smug about to say, oh, we won an anti-communist struggle in Southeast Asia and the Americans didn't. But the situation is very different. It was a lot easier in Malaya because there was no communist power adjacent to Malaysia supplying the communist guerrillas. But anyway, it was agreed that progress would be made rapidly towards independence. And the British colonial authorities had a cordial relationship with the Malay sultans, and that was at 1957. It became independent. It was on a fairly conservative basis. So their law was a blend of Sharia law and English common law and things like that, and didn't completely embrace the English language, had somewhat representative institutions and elections, not so big on freedom of expression. So it was firmly anti-communist, and so not very liberal. You could be liberal and anti-communist, but they were tending more to traditionalism. Let's go back to what we used to have before these Europeans came out here. And the big issue there was, would the Chinese have rights or not? Or the Indians have rights or not? Should they be booted out? They arrive with the British, they can leave with the British. That's what some Malays want. Or only those born in Malaya have citizenship. Those not born there wouldn't. Language, what's the official language going to be? If it is Bahasa Malaysia, the official language of Malaysia, obviously Malaysia got a huge advantage there. The Chinese and Indians don't, and there were race riots. But anyway, they sorted out so their quotas to favour the indigenous people, the Malays. Having said that, there were some people who were in Malaysia, even before the Malays, Orang Asli, as in original men. But they're a tiny community. So we've got to put this in the context of the Cold War, which was crucial. So in the 1950s, 1956, Suez was supposed to draw a line in the sand for the United Kingdom, no more imperial retreat. India was a special case, and obviously that means Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Burma too. And Gold Coast is really an exception. That's Ghana. And Malaysia, all right, they'll go independent. The British Army stayed on for years afterwards. but no more retreat, no more independence. And of course, Suez had precisely the opposite effect because it was such a diplomatic disaster. And then Harold Macmillan became his prime minister. He'd been Chancellor Exchequer. He'd done the sums and said, this costs us more than we get out of it. Let's just liquidate the empire now. Millstones round our neck. That's what Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, said in the 1870s. Why not just be rich? Also, the United Kingdom was recognising there was no big three. There were two superpowers, not three. The United Kingdom could never be a superpower again. It didn't have the population, didn't have the industrial base, and just had to face facts. Try to be, rather than be a superpower and fail, be an excellent second-rate power. Face reality. So that's what the UK did. It was no longer going to live in the past. Plus, the Commonwealth was there a bit of a shock absorber. People didn't have to face up to the fact the United Kingdom was very much diminished in stature. Well, let's look at South Africa. And remember, I mean, it was, part of the Commonwealth, and indeed a Commonwealth realm, to 1962. The Queen was the head of state there. And that's after the Sharpeville massacre. The Commonwealth made moves to expel South Africa from the Commonwealth. What else? Remember, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was every year then. It went on for a week, was a serious matter. And all of a sudden, the majority of Commonwealth Heads of Government were not white. They were non-white, and they were not going to accept this white supremacist policy in South Africa. So rather than be booted out, the South Africans said, let's hold a referendum. Do we want to leave the Commonwealth and end the monarchy? And they voted for that, only whites being allowed to vote. So that became a republic. Republic of South Africa, the Union of South Africa was no more. Remember the two major white communities, the Anglophone one, mostly of British stock, and the Afrikaans-speaking one, mostly of Dutch stock. The Afrikaans language is just a form of Dutch, which is spoken in South Africa. So the black majority were discriminated against by law, as were Indians as well. So the ANC, African National Congress, had been founded in 1912, and in some ways was a liberal organization. It was inspired by the Indian National Congress, notice the name, and it wanted to end to racial discrimination and apply British institutions to South Africa across the board equally. Votes for all. But the South African government was exclusively white. It did not want racial parity, wanted quite the opposite, disparity. So they made almost no progress, and the South African government wasn't even willing to meet with these people, the ANC, who were the only thing to represent the black majority, although the ANC weren't actually elected to anything because there were no elections in which they're allowed to stand. The South African Communist Party existed and had overlapping membership with the ANC. So the ANC became, certainly wasn't conservative, became less liberal, became communist. Not explicitly communist, but tinged that way. As I say, quite a few of its members were communists. They had toyed with reactionary ideas, as in all the whites should be booted out, and the Indians are their lackeys too. But they decided against that. They promulgated their Freedom Charter in the 1950s, said let's have a non-racial society. We're going to have equality for all. What's wrong with that? Equal rights for men and women of all races in South Africa. We can all be South Africans. And they did this partly because it was fair, but also the whites would dig their heels in even more if they realised if the ANC ever win, we're going to be sent packing, if not killed. But there was another group, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was reactionary. Another political party, the Pan-Africanist Congress, rejected almost everything Western. Not science and technology, not completely the English language, because what other common language did they have? Otherwise there were about a dozen languages in South Africa, not all of them even Bantu languages. So they said, really, we'd be authentically African. And by the late 60s, authenticity was becoming a big part of African politics. Let's be genuinely African, let's stop copying the whites. We can do our own thing in terms of clothing, cuisine, everything about our culture, music, dancing. If we do make films, they've got to be distinctively African films. Stop imitating their culture. So that's that. The Pan-Africanist Congress saying, obviously, the whites have got to get out, and the Indians likewise, and be genuinely African. They disliked communism as well, because it was just yet another European ideology. But and the South African government said, ooh, this is good, we can split the anti-apartheid movement. Remember, apartheid in 1948 is these racist laws in South Africa introduced. Now, there had been racial discrimination laws in South Africa long before that, but the apartheid system in 1848, that broadened it and deepened the whole racist system. So, so you can see some of the disagreements there between a more forward-looking strand and a more backward-looking strand of anti-colonialism. But remember, of course, from 1962, South Africa was not in any sense a colony. It's ruled by the white minority, some of them who'd been living there since 1652, when the Dutch first set up permanent settlements there. So it was not controlled by the UK or any other Western country, but people often present it as an anti-colonial struggle. So it's largely the descendants of the immigrants against the descendants of the indigenous people. Look at Rhodesia, which later became Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So in Zambia, that became independent in 1964, if I got that right, led by the United National Independence Party, Kenneth Kaunda, this former teacher, and he made it a one-party state very quickly. He was inclined towards Marxism, not all the way there, was a socialist, had a lot of public ownership. They thought that was the way forward. Remember, they were inclined to look kindly upon the Soviet Union, China, and so on, who had done so much to pressurize Western countries because they thought there might be Third World coming up. These Canadian countries couldn't engage in big wars of repression in case they needed every man they could get to fight the crucial battles of the Cold War in Europe. Some people tried it, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, and the Portuguese in Mozambique, Angola, Goa, Cape Verde Islands, Guinea-Bissau. They did try to hang on to their colonial possessions, and they lost in every case. Of course, the anti-colonial rebels, armed, funded, trained by the Soviet Union and given moral support there. Likewise, the ANC had its armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation, often going to China or the Soviet Union for military training. Chris Hani, SACP leader and doughty anti-apartheid fighter, raved about how wonderful it was in the Soviet Union. So coming back to Zimbabwe, there are two political parties there founded, the Zimbabwean African National Union and Zimbabwe African People's Union. They've both been a Zimbabwean ANC, but they got rid of that. Remember, they only invented the word Zimbabwe in the early 60s. Looking back to this ancient civilization, I think it means like pile of stones and something like that in the Shona language, that the whites had overlooked. They'd found it and they said, who built this? Did Arabs come all the way from the coast, of the Portuguese? Some of the whites being unwilling to accept that indigenous African people were capable of building something so sophisticated. So, and they said, the nationalist movement said, let's reject the word Rhodesia. Remember, that's from Cecil Rhodes, this British megalomaniac who'd set up the country. We don't want his name. So these two movements, they've been somewhat liberal. They turned increasingly radical. They certainly weren't conservative. They were very much Marxist. ZANU more aligned with the Soviet Union, ZAPU more aligned with China, and they're partly based on the two major linguistic groups within Zimbabwe, as in Shona-speaking people tending to back ZANU, and Ndebele-speaking people tending to back ZAPU. And of course, there's some minor other tribes as well, most of whom are part of the Bantu family of nations. And some members of it would openly say they're communists as well. Mugabe said it was a Marxist well into the 80s. So they saw this as being obviously about exploitation. It was a class struggle as much as a racial struggle. But none of them were anti-white as such and had a handful of white members, indeed Indian members, even a Chinese member. Remember Robert Mugabe, he'd been at the Labour Party conference in the UK in the early 60s. So Mugabe, like Kenneth Kaunda, had been a teacher, and they'd gone to Fort Hare College in South Africa, and in some ways they had been moved by fulsome admiration for British institutions, for Parliament, for freedom of the press, for trial by jury and things like that, and they felt bitter disappointment that Britons didn't extend these rights to them. Why were they deprived of these liberties the British purported to hold dear? It was frank racism, and it really stuck in the craw. So they've been quite moderate, but that turned to militancy when they felt that peaceful protests got them nowhere. Anything else about these guys? Well, yeah, take Dr. Hastings Banda, a guy from Nyasa land, now it's Malawi, who'd been studying in Edinburgh, qualified as a doctor, spent decades in the United Kingdom, and in the 50s returned to Malawi, been away for 40 years, he'd forgotten the language, so he'd address people in English, but became a firebrand anti-colonial agitator. And he led the country to independence. But then he became a whalebone-corseted conservative, a real Victorian, running as a one-party state and using colonial-era legislation to throw people into dungeons if they ever dared utter a word against him, on the basis that such a person must be a communist, enforcing this puritanical dress code. He wouldn't allow long hair, he didn't allow hippies, anything like that, believed in gender roles. So that was him. He ruled till he was almost 100 years old, stepping down in only 1995. So in some ways he was conservative, but he wasn't a reactionary, he wasn't rejecting all Western culture. It was just a very old-fashioned version of British culture. Take Julius Nyerere from Tanzania, Tanganyika it was in those days, who also studied at the University of Edinburgh, and he was intrigued by British culture, translating Shakespeare into Swahili and so on. So he was definitely a socialist, trying to transplant some Western institutions into Tanzania, but also believed in having village councils and relying on African traditions of cooperation. So is he liberal, is he conservative? I think he's broadly liberal, but he's also broad-minded enough to think that you can have a melange of the two. You don't have to simply go one way or the other. So he was sympathetic towards the Soviets. He didn't actually become a Soviet satellite. He ruled for many years. A very impressive man, lived very simply, very humble, and certainly wasn't a kleptocrat. Was in politics for the right reasons. It was not about self-aggrandizement. The Caribbean, well, there's so many islands, I wouldn't know where to start, but probably less dramatic, the colonial movement there. It's because, I mean, well, even in the era of slavery, there were legislatures in these islands, and to begin with, only whites were allowed to vote, then free black people, then all black people were free, and Dominica was the first one to have a majority of black men in the legislature in the 1830s, only just after slavery was done away with. So gradually, the black majority advanced in all the other islands to have most of the representation in all these legislatures, and these islands become internally self-governing in the 60s, so that's fully independent, some of the 70s, some of them abolishing the monarchy, becoming republics, not just Commonwealth realms, although several of them remain Commonwealth realms to this day. So mostly more of the liberal tradition, and often they're into socialism, not saying that any of them were fully communist. What else about them? C.L.R. James is perhaps the primary intellectual mover of this movement, agitating from the 1930s, and Trinidad and Tobago, his homeland, only became independent in the 70s. But he was a Trotskyite, so yes, he read Marx, but he was very let down by the Soviet Union, which he felt was a degenerated workers' state. But it was still better than capitalism because they provided something for the penurious. So then in Jamaica, which is obviously the main erstwhile British colony in the Caribbean, the two major parties, the Jamaican Labour Party and the People's National Party. Despite the name, the Jamaican Labour Party is the more right-wing of the two, and what was a little more closely aligned to the United States later on. So in Antigua, there was the Labour Party. A lot of these countries run by a Labour Party. And Trinidad and Tobago is a fascinating one because obviously it's got a large Indian community. The Indian community and the black community were at about parity in numbers till independence. Then there came independence, and the black-dominated political party won the election. Quite a few Indians left the country. So it's now got a clear black majority, some Hispanic people, some white people as well. So it's probably the most multiracial island in the erstwhile British Empire in the Antilles. So, yes, as I say, maybe more liberal movements, even more radical movements there. Every movement is a little bit radical, even by its very nature, because it wants to bring about an overhaul in the situation there. Well, I could go on all night, but perhaps that's just given you a flavour. I can scarcely scratch the surface of such a gargantuan topic.